This is part 2 of a look at some of the evidence we've compiled about how curtilage land at Stoke Lodge was turned into not curtilage land in the space of a few weeks in summer 2018. We talked previously about a few aspects of the letter from the school's planning consultants that was the trigger for the council to review the extent of the curtilage of Stoke Lodge. Council officers had conducted a full review just a few weeks previously and had sent the school a very clear letter on the 13th of July saying that the playing fields were the curtilage of Stoke Lodge. That meant that a planning application would be required for the school to put up a fence. Now, we have plenty of statements about why the council changed its view. It's in a letter sent to We Love Stoke Lodge, and it's in formal minutes of council meetings. So, for example, the minutes of the Development Control Committee of the 30th of January 2019 record that the head of development management stated that BCC had taken advice from council before agreeing that the erection of the fencing was permitted development. In a letter to We Love Stoke Lodge, the head of development management has confirmed that he instructed BCC Legal to consider the information provided by the school's planning consultants and advise. The legal team provided internal advice on the 17th of September 2018, based on that letter, that the playing fields were not within the curtilage of the listed building. Given the contentious nature of this issue, external legal advice was sought. Council provided a definitive view, which was received by the planning team on the 28th of September 2018. I explained last time that the letter from the planning consultants included some major errors. So the internal legal advice based on it was also flawed, as was the external advice. So all of that needs to be reviewed. But let's also focus in on the dates. The external legal advice was received on the 28th of September, and yet we have an email timed at 5:56 on the morning of the 27th of September, making clear that the decision about permitted development has already been finalised. People have been briefed internally and arrangements are being made to write a statement for a press release. So let's be clear, the decision was not taken after considering external legal advice. According to the head of development management, that advice had not been received when this email was sent. Council officers had been briefed at least 2 days before receiving that advice of what the decision would be. The statements made to councillors and recorded in council minutes are specifically untrue. But also notice that at this point it was still thought that landlord consent would be required. It was only later that officers decided that it was possible to interpret the clause in the lease that prohibits the erection of any building or other structures as meaning you can go ahead and erect a 1.5 kilometre long, 2 metre high metal fence that's concreted into the ground without any landlord oversight at all. If landlord approval or intervention by way of a variation to that clause had been required, the council would have had to consider access requirements under its public sector equality duty in the exercise of its powers, to ensure that the fence line and gates provided appropriate access, particularly for those with mobility issues. But then the lease was reinterpreted to give the school a free hand, which led directly to the mayor being told that BCC had no control over development on its own land, and to the mayor stating at full council that the fence is not a structure. I said before that we knew some of what was done, but not necessarily why it was done or who was behind it. More evidence is coming to light, but for the moment what we know for sure is that the legal basis for the U-turn by BCC officers is deeply flawed, and that the decision had been taken without reference to external advice anyway. So whatever that advice says, and officers have repeatedly refused to disclose it on a confidential basis to councillors, it was a done deal anyway, and the advice was presumably geared to that outcome. There are many aspects of this that appear to us to be maladministration and abuse of power, using the planning process to achieve predetermined objectives in favour of a single third-party entity. That's why we're pursuing this issue. Local planning authorities should operate planning law neutrally, not skew fundamental decisions in the interests of one party for political or other motives. Otherwise, any developer with enough political clout can achieve whatever outcome it wants. Whatever view you take about fencing or not fencing the site, we're talking about the estate of a Grade 2 listed building that has played a role in Bristol's history. Council officers should have exercised caution and made every effort to assess the full facts before reversing a decades-long view that safeguarded its own heritage asset. Council officers had taken a coordinated approach in June and July 2018 and confirmed that the playing fields were part of the curtilage of Stoke Lodge. Was it appropriate to reverse that view behind closed doors at the request of a party that wanted to avoid making a planning application, based on misleading and incorrect information, and on suggestions that are easily disprovable from the Council's own records, and to ignore the offer of further relevant advice on the subject? Are these the actions of a local planning authority exercising its powers appropriately? This is the kind of development that illustrates just how crucial a proper planning process is, and why there are safeguards for transparency and oversight by our elected councillors, rather than having decisions made by officers working with an interested party and without any transparency at all. So, how can matters be put right? Legal matters will take their own course, but the Council could take some steps of its own initiative if it wants to be seen to do the right thing. For example, it could obtain a legal opinion from a senior barrister agreed by relevant councillors as being independent of all parties on this issue, rather than, as was done before, a junior barrister at the chambers used by Cotham School. They could ask that barrister to investigate and determine the extent of curtilage at Stoke Lodge, and that's important both in relation to the fence now and to safeguard a council-owned and managed heritage asset in the event of future development proposals at Stoke Lodge. As part of that legal opinion, the Council could obtain advice as to whether permitted development rights apply specifically to the fence as it is currently installed. It's not clear that this has ever been done, particularly since significant elements of the fence line changed during installation. In its capacity as landowner, the Council could recognise that the fence is, in fact, a structure, and as such is not permitted under the lease. And if the school seeks a variation of the lease or separate approval or ratification, it could make clear that conditions may be imposed. That last part is important. The school's planning consultant said that having to make a planning application would be pivotal and devastating, meaning, I assumed, that the school thought the fence would not be approved in the form it wanted. But isn't that the whole point of a transparent planning process? Officers from the equalities, heritage, tree, wildlife and other teams would have a chance to give their input. And the outcome might be agreement to a fence in some form, but with provision for accessible entrances, for example ramps at appropriate points and access-friendly gates. There might be a proper perimeter walkway and a fence design appropriate to a heritage location. Why would a cooperative academy think it was devastating to take those ideas on board? Yes, developers may prefer to avoid going through due process. They may seek to avoid consideration of equalities, heritage and wildlife impacts. But what reason would a local planning authority have for moving mountains, or at least curtilage, to allow them to do so?